All right, shall we begin? Looks like someone just came in, so maybe give it a couple minutes. Sound good? Okay, we've got about 10 people or more signed up, so we'll see. It's only a 20-minute session, and I know there's stuff going on very soon after, so I will probably it's like 1 or 2 minutes is all we want to give it, right? Okay, I'll start at 2:02 sharp. The Bart Simpson meme generator was the highlight of my day, naturally. Oh, looks like we've got some more. Okay, well, why don't we just jump in right here? So, Confessions of a Recovering Lecturer. Sorry for anybody who saw the lecture part without the last R and was expecting like the lecturer that wouldn't die or some 1950s B movie. That was my fault. I just left it out of the Google form. But anyway, this is an issue that wasn't really an issue for me when I started because back when I started, it was just kind of, the habit. That's what I'd known only in college. A good teacher was a good lecturer, and a bad teacher was a bad lecturer. And in grad school, just about all of my teachers were bad lecturers. So being a good lecturer seemed like something to strive for. And, that's how good teachers were described. I'm wondering, since not everybody here is the same age, did anybody here not have the vast majority of their college and grad school classes taught by lecture? I would imagine some of our assistant professors were used to a more active learning approach in college, at least. But no? Okay. All right. Well, active learning was really a term I had not seen before I came here. And even then, it was a few years after I came here. I'm wondering how old were people or how long had they been teaching by the time that they realized that lecturing and teaching were not the same thing as far as what you did in the classroom? Anybody want to jump in? These are not rhetorical questions. I'm really curious to know. I'm thinking for me, it was like around 2005 or so. It was, and it might have been later than that. It was definitely later than that when I realized that active learning was something more than some bullshit buzzword, just like where you pretty much have the kids play in the classroom like the sandbox or something like that. There's so much that I didn't know. I mean, I would say things like, well, what's wrong with chalk and talk if you're good at it? And definitely things have changed somewhat. I think part of it is we've learned a lot about teaching, and those old lecture techniques that we thought worked well with us, back in like the 1980s or 1990s, actually didn't work all that well. We were probably learning a lot on our own outside of the classroom. When I look back, I think most of my learning took place outside of the classroom. Another issue is, and that I think stops a lot of people, including me, from really jumping more wholeheartedly. Oh, we've got some responses on the chat. Okay. Almost all my classes were taught by professors, lecture only, no teamwork until senior year as an undergrad. I was a music major, so my classes were all lectures or performance. And yeah, performance is as active as you get. Okay, problem with the yellow notes thing is that in many ways, the yellow notes problem is not a problem. It's a great time saver. College teaching can be a really easy job if you are willing to do the yellow notes thing. There's a pretty low ceiling for what you're going to accomplish in the classroom with old notes. But the floor is kind of high. You're not going to bomb as spectacularly as you would trying new but potentially very interesting and in the long run useful things. And you'll find that really too many students prefer a passive learning experience, and don't want to have to take part in stuff in class. That can lead to an equilibrium where you go in there, you lecture, students don't complain, and that's that. And if you've got tenure, it's a pretty easy job. The main classes I teach, I will describe what I do and how I try to get away from it being just a lecture sort of class, and how sometimes so often it reverts to being lecture. Money and banking and American economic history, I've been teaching since I came here in 1997. Both of those classes have some things that are really sort of designed to produce active learning and get the student doing a lot outside of class. And as far as what that translates to in class can vary quite a bit. In money and banking, there's always a weekly problem set. We've always had that. Some students really liked that, said that was something that they didn't have in a lot of other classes, and it really kept them kind of going. And I would always tell the students, this is the most important, this is where most of your learning is going to take place, not in lecture, but when you're doing these problem sets, which is, in hindsight, really kind of a funny thing to tell them, because you're in class for 3 hours a week with me. That's not really very important. What I do value is what you're supposed to be doing outside of class, even though I've become increasingly aware that students do not actually spend 3 hours outside of class on each class. So that was probably not a recipe for great success. What I've increasingly been doing is having students do work in class, either for clicker questions, which were multiple choice questions, or working on the problem sets together. The pitfall there is that sometimes the students sit with their friends, they form groups with their friends. There's just a lot of goofing off and a lot of conversation that is really not about problem solving. And that can be kind of frustrating. And after a semester of dealing with that, I have sometimes gone back to just more of a lecture-driven class with the problem solving being done outside of class. I know I've got a couple things here in the chat. I'll take a quick look at that. Ooh, a whole bunch. Oh, I like this. One professor ended his career actually brought in one of his articles and read it to the class. Even my graduate classes were seminars, 3 hours long, 5 to 8 students sitting around the table with a professor, and some profs still managed to turn that into a lecture. Okay. With the economic history class, that one I'd always envisioned as having a lot of discussion. Borrowing something I'd had in an English class in college, I had students write a weekly discussion preparation paper where they would kind of prime themselves with discussion, things that they were willing to talk about in class, questions or comments on the readings. And that definitely helps promote some discussion. It's a good incentive for students to do the readings, but there would always be weeks where some students didn't do the reading, where some wrote a prep paper but didn't bring it to class, didn't even have it available on their cell phone or anything like that. And the majority are not going to speak up, even if they have completely prepared themselves to do so by writing a good paper. And so when there's very little discussion going on in a typical class meeting, lecture is the default that it reverts to. So the reason I'm giving the talk this semester is not just to complain about the way that things have been in my teaching here for 20 some years, but to note that things in this rather difficult semester where I was teaching hybrid, I was in the classroom every time with a small number of students and a lot more on Zoom. I did a couple things differently this semester in these two main classes I teach, Money and Banking and American Economic History, and they seem to work. With Money and Banking, it was almost like a flipped classroom, except I didn't do the recording my lectures in advance. I may try that sometime, though I'm kind of wondering, especially with a small class like that, just how many students would tune in and listen to them. But the lecture notes are there. My lecture notes are basically a chapter, basically a book that I use instead of a regular textbook. So it's fairly skeletal. And the idea has always been that students, that the problem set questions be based on those chapters. And so students would ideally read that in advance, and if not, then certainly use those as their main resource in doing the problem sets. So what I did this time was the chapters or / lecture notes were always there, but I would start with the problem sets. Like, okay, here's problem set 9, it goes with chapter 9. Let's work on these problems. Ideally, it would have been group work, and I would have tried to figure out some way to have it not devolve into social conversations among too many of the groups. Because the attendance was so low in class, the students were basically working solo, which isn't always, it might not be a bad idea. Students would work on these problems solo. The problem sets have to be done solo, so it might not be a bad thing. But students really worked in the classroom, the ones who came, perhaps the most motivated, but they worked on the problems. They were not distracted by other things. After it seemed like people were done, I would call on them and just ask, what do you have right now? And we would go over that, and I would flesh it out a little bit. If nobody had a correct answer, I would give them all some help. But this was something, by the way, that I picked up from another colleague who did this, I thought, very effectively. My colleague, Svetlana Balfas, I observed her one time in the classroom toward the end of last semester, and she was doing that in the labor economics class, problem sets. And it seemed very effective. It was a really good reason to go to class, because you have to turn in these problem sets each week. They're not a huge part of the grade, but they certainly count for something. And the test problems are going to be based on those. So it worked. I definitely would maybe tweak that a little bit next time, but I was pleased with the result. In the economic history class, I had that weekly discussion preparation paper. I continued that. One thing I changed, this might have been something that I got from one of the AQ modules, was that they had to have at least one question for the class. Not a question for me, but a question that they would pose to the class. So that always makes for more interesting prep papers. Paul Samuelson has that wonderful line that good questions outrank easy answers. So that was important. And because a lot of the students were on Zoom, I would often have breakout sessions where groups got together and they just bounced their questions off each other and could discuss those just among themselves. This is another acute thing. And then they could take them to the rest of the class. If they had a question that seemed to have a lot of traction and sustained discussion among these 3 or 4 people, then perhaps it would work the same way in the class. Another thing I did, because it can be difficult to draw out people, even people who are well prepared for discussion, who've written a good paper and so forth, was that because the papers are turned in advance, I would read them, not necessarily grade them in advance, but go through them kind of quickly, note who wrote about what. And then I would call on them. It's not quite cold calling, because if someone didn't write anything, I probably wasn't going to call on them. But I think it was kind of confidence building for a lot of students, because they'd written something good. They had something to say, and this got them to say it. I also gave students the option of posting entirely on Blackboard. So they didn't have to actually speak up in class, especially if they let me know that they weren't comfortable with that. But that everybody had to get a certain number of participation points, and they could get them either on Blackboard or in class. And everybody had to use the Blackboard forum at least a couple times, with one post and one reply. That made for a much livelier discussion board on Blackboard than we normally have. Okay, so one thing I learned is that lecture, you can't eradicate it altogether. I don't think that's really a good idea unless the material is kind of self-explanatory or can be learned simply by just like doing these problems. So I found that lecture is very useful for filling in certain gaps. As long as I treat it more as a residual than as like the main meat of what I'm going to be doing in the classroom, I think it works pretty well. So just note what doesn't get covered in the student-centered part and lecture on that. If there's just something really juicy that I want to share with the students, then by all means, I should do that. In the economic history classes, I found myself, I've always had a lecture outline, like usually 1 page for the whole week that I hand out. And again, I would note who wrote what and call on people at certain points. If I knew that they had something useful to contribute or a good question to ask at certain points. It's always important to me that a lot of people can participate, not just like the 5 or 6 students out of 40 who are always going to be active in class. And these seem like effective ways to draw people out. Lecturing is also useful in a problem-solving class like money and banking if I notice real gaps in students' understanding. Clickers are really good for that. I didn't use clickers because so many of the students were online, and I didn't want to deal with a hybrid clicker sort of thing. I know it certainly can be done, and that it's not an insurmountable obstacle. But when we go back to regular classrooms, hopefully someday, I will probably go back to having clickers and using them as another interactive thing to see what students know and what I need to actually talk about. Okay, so looking for, menu chat. Okay, so not a whole lot of time left. I was thinking if this were a longer presentation, I would try to do some kind of exercise with people here, like maybe breakout rooms to ponder a question or two and then report back to the group. These would be questions like based on mainly on personal reflection, or perhaps breakout rooms for questions that you might have to look up, even if it's just something like Googling, like leading active learning techniques and learning and noting ones that you haven't tried yet. Since we've only got about 5 minutes left, I thought it would probably be more useful to just talk about that among ourselves. So what do people here do as a way to either facilitate discussion or facilitate, problem solving that really goes somewhere in class?
Could we hear from the person who had the transformative graduate school course, please?
Hi, Janet. Yeah, I had a class in graduate school that was called community-based learning class. And that's something that I use that methodology in my own classes, which basically involves working with the community in some way to work on a problem that's existing in the community. And so it's usually interdisciplinary in nature. It's very messy because there's not a single answer, right? But you're using kind of course information and the topic that you're studying to work on that problem.
So what topic did you study? And are you talking about a group of students working with people who are in town? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So in graduate school, we were working on identifying bathrooms in the community that were not gender specific, right? So single stall bathrooms and things, and kind of getting the word out about that for the community of students who are transgender and who may otherwise need kind of a single stall bathroom. So that was a project that I worked on. And as a designer, I helped design some of the materials that help get some of the word out. But we did a lot of other things as well. And then with my own students, we do a lot of work with older adult populations in the community and storytelling and helping to kind of reduce the amount of isolation that people might feel. And so we create exhibits and things with them.
What is your interaction as a teacher, your interaction with your students, and how do you measure what you've accomplished?
We create projects, and then, they have criteria just like you would for a paper or something. So they have to meet certain standards. And so most of the grading and things that I do is rubric based.
Oh, great. Thank you.
One thing that I've noticed is that the online chat in Zoom has provided opportunities for students to participate who otherwise might not have if it was in a face-to-face class, unless you directly called on them. And I think that might be something that would be helpful to maintain in some way, maintaining a back channel or something to give students that opportunity to participate who are not very comfortable volunteering as often.
I like that. I hadn't really thought too much about that. Normally when students who were on Zoom participated, it was just by speaking. So yeah, the chat function, you're right. Definitely a lot of people use the chat function who would not speak up, would not unmute themselves. So chat function in Zoom.
My students were really active on chat, John, too. And then I don't know if it's, you know, the kind of class or whatever, but like it would be silent, right? You ask a question to be silent, but the chat was like crazy. Like people were really responding. So I would just kind of summarize what was going on in the chat.
And a good technique is what Derek Breff called a 3-2-1 go, and what other people are calling now a chatterfall or a chat, something similar, where you just ask people to type something in, type in a response to something, you know, the first things they think about on a topic or something similar, but don't submit it until you give them the signal to press return. And that way everyone is entering something that's not in response to what other people thought. So you can bring in a wider mix of ideas that way.
Chatterfall.
Just asking everyone to type something into the chat and then all press return at once, and then you can go through it. Or you could use polling software to do the same thing, including the iClicker Cloud option, where you could have students all type in free response questions and then share them with the class once you've had a chance to glance at them or until everyone has submitted. I actually experimented a few times after the waterfall chat after Derek Breff had mentioned it, and students liked it.
I missed that lecture. Could you put it into one sentence, John?
Oh, basically, you just ask students a question to respond to with a brief response in chat, but you ask them to hold their response until you tell them to submit.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know the term for what you described. Thank you.
Yeah, I like that. You don't have the stealing thunder issue that you would otherwise.
You don't have a few voices dominating that you have to kind of suppress and bring others out. Everyone gets an equal voice there. And I do have to say, Hypothesis is another tool that's been really useful in providing voices to students, where if you give students an assigned reading, which could be peer review of other students' work, it gives them an opportunity to reflect and think about their comments and feedback directly in the document they're reading, which means, among other things, they actually have to read the document. And you could do that with any type of readings. For example, if you're posting your notes in class, or that book you've created, you could do that as a hypothesis document where students could pose questions and responses and reply to each other and so forth.
I don't think I realized that Hypothesis could be used for documents that aren't already in their database.
It's any document in a digital format. If you're doing it within Blackboard, it has to be stored as a PDF effectively. But other than that, anything you can convert to a PDF could be used as a basis for the discussion, where the discussion takes place right in the document, which could include voice comments, it could include images, it could include comments. It even has a math equations editor built into it.
I have a quick question for you, Randy. So you mentioned to use the breakout rooms. I think it really works well when we use Zoom, right? But what if I do that in my classroom? Because I don't know if that's the case for all of your students, because my students always sit in the same seat. So I like to, to separate students randomly so that they can work with everyone. How do you deal with that?
I haven't tried that. I mean, when I put together groups for like a group research paper or something like that, they don't get to pick who is in their group for that. But I feel like it would be too much effort to just say I'm going to seat everybody alphabetically, or I'm going to seat people in this particular order. I don't know. I think students would tend to resist that kind of social engineering in the classroom. So, I mean, I can encourage them, good idea to partner with somebody you don't know, or the person behind you rather than the person next to you. But That is a little tricky. And in this particular case, with the economic history class this semester, I had students. The breakout rooms were always set up as the groups for these research papers. I wanted them to get to know each other better, because a lot of them didn't know people in their research groups.
Okay, we are going to have to stop, unfortunately. This is a topic for really good discussion, and I wish we did allow more time, but we're going to have to exit just so we can break out it turns out we have to do that to split out the attendance and so forth for records. So thank you. We will end the recording, and this will be posted later today.